and Athens are important cities which attract thousands of tourists. But the sad thing is that Patna has no memory of Patliputra. There's a small archaeological park out there. And of course, Shishupalgarh is in ruins. The list of actual monuments which are in a terrible shape in these cities is also something that we don't know because there is no listing in many of these cases. So the attempt in this show is really to try and figure what is the problem with our cities. And over the last couple of days, we've been running a campaign to try and get people to participate, to post pictures, and we've had an overwhelming response from all of them. So let me introduce you to our guests today, and we've got a fabulous lineup of guests, all of whom have worked very closely with us on our journey in Live History India. I start by introducing Swapna Little, a historian, author, and also the head of the Delhi chapter of INTAC. We have Mr. Devashish Nayak, architect and one of India's foremost names in the field of heritage conservation. He's the man who has been behind the entire campaign to list Ahmedabad as a World Heritage City. He's perhaps the go-to man for any government, any state that is looking at walking down this path of maintaining and really showcasing their heritage. We also have Pushkar Sohni, who is, again, author and historian and an expert on the Deccan region, medieval Indian history. And we have Dipanjan Ghosh, a columnist with us at Live History India, and also someone who has been very closely associated with the mapping of Murshidabad, a city which was once a great capital, and it is really in a very bad shape. So we are going to be talking about all of that. Swapna, I'm going to start off with you. You know, I've also had the pleasure of spending time with each one of you, traveling with you. So I'm really blessed in that sense. So Swapna, I'm going to start with you. One would think that Delhi, a city with 7 cities within it, the capital of India, city with such a storied past, would be a perfect example of what you can do with heritage in the national capital. But I remember going with you to what I think is one of the most spectacularly important sites in Delhi, a site that predates Shah Jahanabad within Shah Jahanabad, and that is the tomb of Razia Sultan. And it's in a terrible situation. And I remember us talking about how that kind of represents a lot of what is wrong with the way we look at heritage and how we engage with it. So I really want you to start with that.
Thank you so much, Minnie. And it's such a pleasure to be on this and to be given the chance to interact with so many nice panelists and yourself, of course. I think you're right. I remember that visit of ours to Razias Tomb, and yes, it's very strange because for us, Razia is so. Apart from the history of it, in the popular imagination, Razia is spoken about so much, and we hear so much, read so much, in a superficial sense, no doubt, but we do. And very few people even know where she is buried or even go there. And when you go there, and this is an ASI protected site, but on the other hand, you find once you go there, it's a very simple site. That's fair enough. Very little remains, of course. It's a couple of graves surrounded in a walled enclosure with a mosque on one side. And what you have then is it's surrounded, it's completely hemmed in. There's no way you'll be able to find it. Now, the problem with that sort of thing is that we tend to look at it from an eye which expects monuments to be a certain way, set in a large park or whatever. So we must remember that sometimes these monuments are not, every monument is not a Sachi, so this can be a monument. I think the lesson to be learned from Razia's tomb is it's a monument which is in a very living, thriving community. And the maintenance problems that are there, the management problems, those are the things that have to be looked at. And until we can bring our communities who live around it, because it is so intensely hemmed in, and these are not, we should stop thinking of them as encroachers. They are not encroachers. In fact, the people who live around Razia's tomb, there's been a community living there for centuries. Razia was buried in 1240, but particularly after Shahjahanabad was founded in the 17th century, this became a part of a very fairly densely populated area. So it's had people living around it for a long time. So those are all problems, or not problems. These can be turned into positives. This is not abandoned heritage. Very often you think that there is abandoned heritage. This is very much there. It's a pity that it's surrounded by people with so many things going for it, and still it is relatively neglected.
It raises a lot of issues. I used to always wonder whether it's better for a monument or a site to be in the midst of a bustling city where it can get taken care of, or is it better to be far away where it cannot be hampered with? Okay, but this is going to be a debate I'm going to ask all of you questions on. But Pushkar, if I can come to you. I went with you to Ahmednagar, and the site that I remember, and it's etched in my memory, is a site of Ahmad Shah's tomb with a little field around it. And this is a field that there was a farmer working with a bullock cart right in the middle of that place. And it was actually within the walls of the tomb. So it was not even as though they had encroached into the site. They had encroached literally into the tomb. I wonder if we can play that visual out for you. But when you see something like that, and I know you've been going to Ahmednagar for the last 20 years, what is the state of the monuments in a city like Ahmednagar, which was such a powerful capital?
Well, to begin with, very few monuments or important buildings within the city have any kind of protected status. And legal protection is just one measure that can be afforded. So they can be protected by the Archaeological Survey of India or the State Archaeology Department. But I think people need to have a sense of ownership over a lot of these things. And to add to what Swapna was saying, unless people feel some kind of stake in the preservation of these, and this can only happen through informing them of what these things were and why they are important. And perhaps farming inside a tomb enclosure is not the worst kind of encroachment, because all it's doing is, roughing up the surface. There are worse kinds of encroachment where people actually build in there. People start, in some cases, inhabiting it where historically it has not been inhabited. And of course, as a lot of monuments which used to be on the periphery of cities are increasingly coming within the ambit of fast urbanizing areas, we see real estate interests also take a front seat. And it would be good if there was a class of protected monuments where community engagement could somehow be one of the protective mechanisms, as opposed to saying a 100-meter line or a 50-meter line, which cannot be uniformly applied all across the country and for every class of monument. So we do not have a clear understanding of why certain things are declared as monuments of national importance, others are on state lists, and a lot is left unprotected. And perhaps it's time to rationalize all these lists and lay down certain kinds of criteria, which can then be applied, declaring things to have different levels of protection.
Right. Right. Pushkar, I must ask you a quick follow-on question before I go to Mr. Naik. I have a sense that we've done worse damage to our monuments in the last 20 years than we have done in the last, say, 40, 50 years, because it seems as though this rush to urbanization, this encroachment of land, the spilling over of cities, all of this has had a very bad impact on our core heritage areas. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think there's a certain pattern to all older settlements in cities where anybody with the means to moves out because the area becomes unlivable after a point, which has also led to rapid urbanization. People keep moving out from the center. And people who are left behind in the center are often people who don't have the means to move out. And there is a general level of squalor in all these areas. In any case, I think somehow, again, thinking about heritage is never part of any kind of town planning processes, neither in terms of systems processes like transport and so on, nor in terms of land use patterns. And I think this really needs to be firmly on the agenda for any kind of planning process. It just hasn't been.
Right. And it's a sad thing, actually. So, that's where Mr. Naik comes in, because I think he holds a flag for all that can be done. Because Ahmedabad is a great example of a very systematic, structured approach with great patience, if I may add, Mr. Naik, because it took 20 years of hard work to get Ahmedabad listed as India's first UNESCO World Heritage City. And that's quite amazing because Ahmedabad is not really India's oldest city. It's a 600-year-old city. And it was really the sheer gumption with which all of you went at it that I think made it the first city to go up on that list. So explain to us how you went about doing it, because it is a lesson in patience, isn't it?
Oh,
Mr. Naik, I think your audio is muted. Yeah.
Ahmedabad is extremely lucky that it has got great institutions which have been studying Ahmedabad for various social and architectural and various ways. And second is a very active and conscious citizenship. The people who headed the municipal corporation for centuries are the most respected citizen. The Ranchodlal Chotalal who was the president of the municipal corporation. He actually is one of the top industrialists of the town and got the India's first underground drainage system. And another important thing is that it has been there for last 600 years and with very active citizens participation. So Ahmedabad, I feel, is very lucky, and Ahmedabad is one of the very highly documented city, and there are beautiful drawings available, including Archaeological Survey of India, which have got around nearly more than 50 nationally protected monuments within the walled city. Is they're all beautifully documented, very good drawings have been there. So theoretically, if you look at it, but I also agree with Mr. Pushkar that our in our town planning system, old cities are always marked as a very negatively. Like in Delhi, our Delhi master plan, the old city called Lal Dora area, always marked as a slum. So whole attitude to the old city is very negative. But the citizens are from there, and people own it. All the history and stories are from the old city. So in Ahmedabad, I could give credit to the government there, the municipal corporation. They actually invited somebody from outside to do something with the heritage of Ahmedabad, and municipal corporation who hosted this whole initiative, spearheaded this initiative, is to be congratulated because for the long time, municipal corporation support is very, very crucial. And also we could do, and as you know, Ahmedabad is a place of business. People understand business very well, and so the creative financing is also another very, and lot of financial procedures have been experimented. Started with agreement with Hatco, and first time the Hatco loan, as I told you earlier, the bank finance is not available for the old city. So Hatco and municipal corporation initiated that. The government of France also had a long, almost 7 years of involvement to study Ahmedabad with the municipal corporation, and eventually we had now coming up with the TDR, transfer of development rights, which is generating a lot of funding for restoration of the property, and including a celebration of heritage weeks, celebration of Ahmedabad's birthday, and various festivals. So
Right.
which engaging citizen, it is very, very important how one must study that how a citizens program really triggered off along with the government for its success story.
Absolutely. Let me come to Dipanjan. Dipanjan, we had your story, The Death of a Capital. That's how you
Mhm.
described Murshidabad yesterday. And
Yes.
I love the lines with which you opened, because you said visitors keen to relive the charms of Murshidabad better come with a lively imagination, because there is
Mm.
nothing really out there in a nutshell. And
Yes.
it's terrible. I mean, Murshidabad, I know, was a capital for a brief period because the Battle of Plassey kind of shifted
Right.
the balance of power, so to say. But it is really a story of neglect, and also there is not even a basic listing, as you've been pointing out in your stories, of the monuments over there. So we don't even know what we are losing.
The problem is, yeah, Murshidabad, every time I go back, it just makes me so sad because, I mean, yes, it was the capital for only about 50 years, up until Plassey, and then the entire focus shifted to Calcutta. But even then it was a capital city, and when you go there now, it's so difficult to imagine what the city was like, even like 250 years ago, because we have completely failed to look at Murshidabad as a site. We have failed to look at it as a historic city. The way we're operating now is to look at it in terms of isolated monuments. So you have the Hazarduari Palace, which is preserved. You have the Nizamati Mambara, which is preserved. And you have three or four other sites which the ASI has taken up, and there's some amount of preservation happening. The rest of the city has just been permitted to rot, for lack of a better word. I mean, people have been permitted to do whatever they want with it, which means they have been systematically dismantling the old capital. In Murshidabad, even today, if you see construction that is happening, in a lot of cases, old bricks are being used, which means old buildings have been dismantled to build new ones, and it's happening on a daily basis. On top of that, I think the imagination is really needed, because the last person to do just a basic listing of all the monuments, like this is the city and this is what you can see, is a guy called Purno Chandra Mojumdar, who I believe worked under the Nawab at that time, and he was able to do this with Nawab's help. He published a book called The Masnad of Murshidabad, which we're still using. The problem with that book is it's from 1904. So that is the last time really anybody tried to make a list of the monuments. And every time I've gone back and tried, I've either found the monuments in much worse shape than what they were in, or I haven't managed to find them at all, because either the monument itself has disappeared or the place names have changed, which makes it very difficult to try and locate something. Uh, for example, I think you had this family called the Kanungos, who were, I guess, a sort of a Mughal vigilance department. So if you submitted documents and all of that, they'd be doing verification to make sure that you weren't trying to fool anybody. And they made a spectacular amount of money from this sort of employment at the court, and they had a huge house. In 1904, Mazumdar describes the Kanungo Palace as being in a precarious condition. So I actually went out looking for it, and went through several villages and ended up traveling through paddy fields and all of that. And when I finally got there, I realized that one wall of the palace was all that remained. One solitary wall. That is it. And nobody knows that this is what that wall actually once was, which is very sad. I mean, it's impossible even to get a sense of how large the city was.
Yeah.
So much has changed and so much has been allowed to
Complexity,
change.
added complexities that we've got so much of layering within our cities. Talking about this particular palace, as Dipanjan was speaking about it. So now let's shift focus to the Khazanchi Haveli that we visited when we were in Shahjahanabad. Again, there is another layer of complexity, because when you talk about Shahjahanabad, you think of the Red Fort and the marvelous work that is being done over there to create museums, etc. But it's really in the gullies and the bylanes that you have the history, the layered history of Shahjahanabad. Now, Khazanchi Ki Haveli is a classic example of a privately owned property where nobody knows what really to do with it because it's so expensive to maintain. And that's also a problem in India, because outside the purview of the ASI and the state archaeological departments, there's also a bunch of private properties where, in fact, it's so difficult. I've heard it say that, families often say that let it just go to rot because it's easier that way. Because, the moment you have a heritage listing, you have additional problems. You can't sell it, you can't use it commercially. So there are many, many challenges. Is that also a very big problem when we look at heritage?
The example that you give, yes, it's, there are many, many Havelis in Shahjahanabad. One thing about Delhi is that at least a lot of documentation has been done over the years. I mean, as far as INTAC is concerned, INTAC has been doing listing, apart from the ASI listing. The ASI listing, of course, exists, and there are 150 plus monuments which are there. But beyond that, heritage buildings, Intact has been listing them, and it was an exercise that was done more than 2 decades ago. And that listing has been added to a lot. I mean, hundreds of Havelis are actually legally protected within Shahjahanabad itself, which is the 17th century city of Delhi. And there are a few problems with that. One problem is that it's not enough to have a listing. Listing gives you legal protection, but unless you have policies on what this is going to be, and again, no matter even if you multiply the number of buildings that are deemed worthy of protection, you still have to look at the city as a whole. The space, what Dipanjan is talking about, these are not isolated monuments. You have to see if there are a couple of Havelis, for instance, what's happening next to them? Are the buildings around them going to go into 6 stories high or whatever? Are you going to have high rises there? What is going to happen? Are you going to have a mall next to a Haveli? So all those things are there. And then, of course, the idea that Shahjahanabad is very ironic. You have on the one hand, you say it's congested, and then there are these heritage assets which are just sitting there and crumbling. And as you very rightly say, owners are hoping that they will crumble away because there's, all the legislation does is impose sanctions against them. You may not do this, you may not do that. But as to positives, as to what they, and it's of course not, there are some breaks that are given. You have some property tax break. You do have the option of changing use. For instance, if it's a residential, you can put it to commercial use. If it is not incompatible with how you restore the building, etc. If you do it, you do get some benefits, but it's not enough. And finance is a very, very important part of it, and we have not got it. And that's a big problem there. So there is a lot of layered history, but we have to treat the city as a whole. We have to take the people along with it, because we will not be able to implement any law unless the people find something in it, that there should be some benefit in following the law. And
right.
that those policies are missing, I think.
Right. Mr. Naik, one quick comment on the financing, because I know you have strong views on this, and I think that's a very valid point. And then I want to come to you on the stakeholders. In this conversation, we realized that the stakeholders have to be taken in and made part of the solution, really, in heritage management. And Ahmedabad, you did a very good job in getting 2 very crucial stakeholders together. One is the municipal authorities, because at the end of the day, it's their mandate to manage it. And the second is the local community. So let's talk very quickly about financing, and then let's talk about these 2 stakeholders. Mr. Naik, your audio is again.
And I agree with your, but the finance and the community participation is very much connected. What happened in Ahmedabad, see, people have stories, and one need to strengthen the stories so that people feel associated and they spend money. And most of the projects done in World City of Ahmedabad are actually financed by the community, and also creative financing by the municipal councillors and MPs and MLAs. They never really spend their money for the whole city, and a lot of the quote unquote items, which was included some kind of soft infrastructure, kind of paving, drainage, some kind of, there are a lot of bird feeders, unique bird feeders in Ahmedabad. Before, no one was allowed to spend money for that. So, but with the municipality initiative and a prior planning, a lot of this unused finance is being utilized, and community also felt ownership. So you have the statue of different poets. What we have managed to do is a lot of small squares where people live around. Small squares have been improved with the story. So I think that how you strengthen the people's imagination, connect to their stories, and connect with the government system, I think it works very well.
Talking about stories, Pushkar, I mean, Deccan is full of stories. Look at the capitals that we have over here. You have, from the early part of the medieval era right up to, perhaps Bijapur, Golconda, Hyderabad. It's just scattered with cities. And I know you've done considerable work on each of these. Many of them you've actually gone and spent time in. Where do you think some bit of heritage management is working, and where do you think, which is the one in the worst condition according
I think places where, again, local communities feel invested in what they have around them. Sometimes it's for very prosaic and mundane things like earning a livelihood. Uh, and sometimes it's because of a certain kind of pride they feel a connection with things around them, which they recognize as part of their own heritage. That's where things seem to work the best. Sudden demolition of the bazaar in Hampi a couple of years ago caused a big furor because it was meant to be a bazaar. It was operating as a bazaar, but everybody was evicted as an encroacher. What they could have done was have guidelines for those people to operate so that they don't cause any kind of irrevocable damage in those areas. And of course, the worst sites are the ones where the communities around them have absolutely no connection, either perceived or real, and therefore could not care less because these are just eyesores in their eyes. They would be beautiful. I mean, the same building, if it's imbued with a story, if it's given a narrative, suddenly becomes an attractive destination. If you know nothing about it, it's just an old derelict building. And so, again, I mean, I don't think it's always only at the level of legislation, but engaging people and with some of these stories that you mentioned. I think stories are a very powerful way. I mean, history writing is also telling a story, perhaps in technical language, but eventually it's stories that are going to bring people together. And which is why I think Live History India does a good job.
And thanks for that, Pushkar, because that's exactly what we believe in. That's what we've been doing. It's the stories that make India. Because history is perceived as something which is boring, which is chronological, which our education system has kind of, ruined for us. But it's the stories that make India that we are looking at. And Dipanjan, what amazes me out of Calcutta is that we've got a fantastic bunch of contributors who are from there. We keep getting letters from people around Calcutta saying, can I write on this? Can I write on this? There is a lot of interest. But how do we translate this interest into something more? Of course, Live History India is a platform for exactly this because we've been able to create a large community of about 150 contributors. But how do we translate? How do we get Murshidabad excited about its history?
I'm sorry, how do we get Murshidabad
excited about its own history?
That is honestly, I've seen it happening with other towns. For example, when the Danish Tavern was restored in Sirampur, and the other Dutch buildings were restored, I've seen the town people very, very excited. I was there to photograph the opening of the Danish Tavern, and literally half the town turned up, and it was like a party, and people were overjoyed, and they were comparing it to Chandanagar, which is known for its beautiful strand and all of that. And they were saying, finally we have something to compete with Chandanagar now. So I've seen it happening. It's not like it's impossible, but with I think a lot of it depends on the degree of education that you have and the amount of interest that you're able to create in the locals. Like Pushkar was saying, locals have to see value in preserving something. So in Murshidabad, in a lot of other sites, the problem is that buildings are not very often not looked at for their historic value. So if you have an old mosque, for example, a very old mosque, which is still a functioning mosque, then preservation becomes a major issue because people will say, oh, we're having problems with the floor here. Why don't we put marble? We're having problems with the wall there. Why don't we put tiles? And so the historic character of something gets completely lost. With Murshidabad, I think there are a group of people, I keep running into them, who are enthusiastic about the place, but I think more people need to see value, need to understand that, why it would be a good idea to preserve a capital city instead of just having mushrooming hotels, which is happening all over the town. There are hotels like every 20 feet probably right now. So, I mean,
yeah, so I think that really brings the community, because the more one talks about the cities, it cannot happen if local communities are not involved. And Swapna, for a long time, you've been saying that our entire idea of what heritage management should be is a very Western construct. It's a very structured kind of approach, and it might not work in the Indian context. So I know that as part of Intact, you're actually leading a lot of walks, you're creating a lot of public awareness. What are the 2, 3 steps that have worked for you? And then I'm going to get Mr. Naik in, because he's got some very fascinating statistics on how many towns in India are actually working towards this. So let's start with you, Sapna. What do you think works?
I think, and this is just plainly the Delhi experience and what has happened in Delhi. One positive thing is that the state government for several years now, and it's been for a good couple of decades, has been taking an interest. I mean, there has been legislation, there has been taking in hand of a lot of monuments. Delhi, as you know, has a lot of scattered old buildings which were standing on public land, which are not really technically owned by anybody except maybe if it's on DDA land, then it's DDA's building. Though it may be a tomb or an old mosque which is not used. And a lot of those were brought under the, and this has been a process which I think Intact played a very important role in this, in lobbying the state, etc. PILs going to the court also helped, because that was the way in to bring in a lot of a heritage clause into the municipal bylaws. So that helped, and lobbying the state, of course, which put in some amount of legislation, documentation, the fact that the State Department actually began to, I don't think that everything can go to the ASI. In fact, that's a very frustrating process often, because ASI is very reluctant to take on more responsibilities of protection of new sites. So I think enactment of state laws really that helped. And far as Delhi is concerned, it has helped, because the state has then gone ahead and done a lot of protection on its own, and conservation also. So that is moving forward. I think where we lack is, again, this idea of not being able to see heritage in private hands and how to really deal with that. Again, I'm coming back to that whole idea of, and that is what plagues something like Shahjahanabad. Of course, the Delhi problem, there's another problem. Just because it is the capital, I mean, we're talking about old capitals. This is a capital which is a capital today of the country. And that brings its own problems. When you look at New Delhi, for instance, New Delhi is the capital. It was built by the British as a capital. Now that is invested with so much complex political baggage that comes with that status as heritage. What heritage is? So there are a lot of questions which we are still, I think, grappling with. It should be simple enough. That's part of our history. It's our history. You know, it's been the capital from 1912 onwards, and this particular New Delhi since 31. So it should not be difficult to grapple with that, but it is. You know, if we think colonialism was bad, then do we throw out a colonial city? Do we rework it? Whatever. So all those kind of things. So we have a very complex situation in Delhi, that on the one hand, there's neglect. On the other hand, there's too much attention to some aspects of.
I have a whole bunch of questions on the central list and all of that. I mean, I'm sure our viewers are wondering why we haven't touched upon that, because that's such a hot topic. But I do want to start with something which has already got so much of attention, and I really want to shift the focus to other areas. I'm also going to take in some questions from viewers, because we've got a whole bunch of it, and I've been trying to kind of get my focus on that. But and also Pushkar has to leave us at 6:50. But so I'm going to start with this. So we have a viewer who's asked, can a case be made for relocating monuments from unfavorable neighborhoods to a more managed archaeological park or museum? That's a very tough one. I mean, Pushkar, do you think there is a case for something like that? Or are monuments so scattered and so difficult to do that it's impossible to do something like that in India?
I think we've moved away increasingly from the view that things should be isolated from their context. So just like, national forests and national parks are preferred to zoological gardens, or how people prefer live plants to cut flowers, I think unrooting monuments from their context takes away a large part of the spatial experience. I think what needs to be preserved is that experience itself. again, monuments in dense and rich sites often talk to each other. And so you cannot really recreate contexts. And one of the biggest contexts you have is that of a living community. And you certainly cannot erase that in any way.
Right.
In extreme cases, it has been done. I mean, famously, it's happened with the temple of Abu Simbel in the construction of the Aswan Dam. It's happened in places like Nagarjun Konda, where there has been some salvage archaeology. Things have been moved, removed, shifted, but it's really not desirable. I mean, it's the last, this is really it's amputation of a kind. It might save a life, but
Yeah, absolutely. Another point has come in on Aurangabad, so I'm going to ask that question to you only, Pushkar. Can Aurangabad, shouldn't it be, worked on like Ahmedabad to become a World Heritage Site, because it's also got some very fabulous monuments, Ajanta Ellora are there. Is there any work being done on that?
There was a feasibility study done not too long ago. Unfortunately, not enough of the fabric of Aurangabad survives. So you have isolated monuments, but nothing that ties it together. And in the past 2 decades, in the efforts at widening streets, a lot of what might not be considered historic buildings because they're not from the Mughal period or before, but certainly what would be historic buildings from the 19th and early 20th century have been torn down. And this also has to do with our perceptions of what's historic and what's not. Things that are 50 years old can be heritage. A good example was the Hall of Nations torn down at Pragati Maidan. It's the only modern example of modern architecture which was celebrated for its architecture on a postage stamp in India, and it's the building we've managed to pull down.
One wonders how these decisions are taken, but I'll pose another question. Mr. Naik, I'm going to ask you a question. We often hanker behind World Heritage City status for our cities, but what's the big deal in it? I mean, shouldn't our government be taking care of our cities anyway, our ancient cities? Why do we need a UNESCO stamp to do so? This is a question that has come, and I'd love to ask you that.
Thank you for the question. I just continue a little bit with Pushkar's, that Hall of Nation bringing down. In Ahmedabad, this Calico Dome, which is only built in 1950s, has been declared as a heritage monument. And it has been bought by the municipal corporation and actually now getting restored with the spending of almost 3 crore. And it has been preserved and is a example as a modern architecture. But because of this space frame and the modern mathematical calculation of an Indian engineer, it has been declared as heritage. So perception is important. But I feel there's the World Heritage status because India had none. So it was to start with. Now we don't have to keep on stamping other cities as a World Heritage cities, but it gives you a framework and the process. So that like the way when Ahmedabad municipality started its India's first heritage department in the municipality, so every city came and wanted to learn about it. Similarly, once the heritage, the one of the good part of UNESCO process is that the whole process is very transparent, and you can actually go to the website and download the whole management plan. And if you look at the management plan, which every city wants to maybe attend that, maintain their history. Maybe the citizen wants to maintain the history. But what is the guideline? So, and one is the guideline, one is the practical guideline, how to implement the guideline. So that way, Ahmedabad, now part of Bombay, and now Jaipur, 3 cities now being in the World Heritage List, have enough experience, and I think it's very crucial. And what led to Ahmedabad's decision to go for to get into World Heritage List was never the idea. It was municipality was doing it anyway. But when we managed to call all the World Heritage Cities of Asia and did an international conference in 2010, that Asian World Heritage Cities Conference, where that time Mr. Modi ji was our chief minister, and he really supported the municipality, and municipality called all the cities of the Asia World Heritage Cities, and that opened up the decisions makers' mind that Ahmedabad also can try. And immediately after that, that process initiated. So I think Ahmedabad, I totally agree that one have to go through become a World Heritage or UNESCO city, but it creates a framework which one can follow.
Right. You know, the irony is that, on paper, there are many, many policies intended to protect our heritage. The Hriday scheme, which was started in 2015, has identified cities. It has given a corpus of 500 crores. And I was doing some digging around. There are a couple of cities: Amritsar, Ajmer, Gaya, Kanchipuram, Mathura, Varanasi, Velankani. But the point is, Mr. Naik, in India, I feel that the biggest problem with heritage is really whose child is it? I mean, which ministry does it come under? Who is giving accountability about how the money is being spent? Because when you develop a heritage city, it's a 360-degree development that you're doing of infrastructure, of the monument itself, etc. And every time you have multiplicity of departments looking at it, be it a culture ministry, a education ministry, a history, a tourism ministry. I don't know how many ministries are looking at this. I mean, how do you get the government to be accountable? Because on paper we have all solutions, but on the ground we know that there's a huge gap.
No, I see. I feel that every city, the citizens group should be conscious, and they actually make a dummy dossier, in the sense a management plan. And moment everybody has this management plan, which is maybe informally done, then the different agencies will get interested, and you have to keep on doing festivals. You have to keep on doing these walks, and then it will bring together a conscious and managed quite conscious citizenship who will lead it. Ultimately, it has to be driven by the community, and through that, and government will definitely support that process. So we have to do small things. The secret of Ahmedabad work is it is done by very small steps, and but taken continuously. And some point of time we used to initiate 200 files in the municipality, so that some projects, so every month at least we could see 5 projects getting matured. And another role is the media. Today in Gujarat, no media can survive without writing about heritage. So the media is actually restoring the people's mind. The first work is to how you restore the perceptions of the community about their own place. So that is the secret, and that's why the management plan is very important.
And that's what we are trying to do really with all our series, like the story of our cities, etc. Pushkar, you have to leave us, but I'm going to quickly ask you. For 20 years you've been mapping the monuments of Ahmednagar and a lot else, but I'll focus on Ahmednagar. What is the resistance point that you see, which is the most critical on the ground, which needs to be fixed like yesterday if we are to save a city like Ahmednagar's monuments?
I think people are resistant to any kind of surveying of their property, whether they own it or live in it. And it's because they suspect that the government in some form or agency is going to take over. Declaring anything as heritage or historic or important is going to make them lose their place. This is the biggest fear everybody has. Why are you here? Don't come in. We don't want this noticed. We don't want this recorded. We don't want it documented, because it can mean trouble to us in the future. And that really is the resistance. Once you explain to people what you're doing and how you're unconnected with any government, people are a lot easier to talk to, and they will let you in. And you just have to assure them that it's not going to find its way in a file somewhere to the top. So in many ways, I think people have immediate concerns. They're not going to be unhappy if you tell them how important something is, but they just don't want to see their primary
Right.
business place taken away, restrictions being put in, and so on.
Right. Of course, that is one point, Pushkar, that we keep coming back to the issue of community and the participation, because nothing can be done without the community. I think you leave us here. Thank you so much for joining us today. But as a bit of trivia, I must also share with you the story of Mumbai. I don't know how many of you who are logged in are from Mumbai, but I'd love to show you one particular monument, which I think reflects all that is wrong in the way we look at our heritage, and that is the Mahim Fort. We've done a whole lot of work around it, and I think it will be sad if I don't point that out, because I have to hold the flag up for Mumbai in this panel. But the Mahin Fort is perhaps one of the most important historic monuments in this part of Mumbai. Of course, Mumbai is very, very layered as far as history is concerned, and that's not something that people associate with the city. But the Mahin Fort is perhaps the earliest fortification of early medieval Mumbai. And what has happened to it is really the story. It is today a very massive slum. There are about multiple, I think, hundreds of families who are living there. That's the site of the Mahim fort that you can see completely dwarfed by the buildings around it. But that's, of course, okay. But it's when you go in there. And from what we've heard, the ASI officials themselves have not been able to visit the Mahim fort for the last 15 years because it's so full of slums, and they're scared for their own safety. And that's the way we treat our heritage, because this is this was part of the capital of Raja Bhimdev in the 13th century, if I'm not mistaken, and it was called Mahikavati, which is really where the word Mahim, the name Mahim comes from, and that's where the Mahim fort is. So I thought we must show this to you because this kind of indicates for you exactly where we are as far as heritage is concerned. Sometimes, Swapna, I feel that a little bit of ambiguity has been left because it's safer to be ambiguous about heritage. It's safer to, have a little gray area so that you can maneuver around it. And that's really come through even when you talk about a subject like the Central Vista, reimagining the Central Vista, because there weren't really any rules there. So what are you fighting against? What is this ambiguous kind of a system we have? How do we tackle something as basic as that?
I'm just going to say, excuse me, but I'll take my leave. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, ambiguity, of course, is there, and that is very important. That is a problem. And gray areas, yes, of course, gray areas. I think as far as, and I think this is something that we are going through right now, particularly, as I say, a site like Central Vista, which is contested from the colonial history point of view. And I think colonial history is one of those eras in our past that is quite problematic because we don't know how to deal with it. Another site in Delhi actually has been for instance, Coronation Park.
Yeah.
And these are where the coronation darbars took place. And there is, we've tried very hard to have it landscaped and everything. And we've stalled on the question of an interpretation center. Because I think there is, particularly at the level of officialdom, there is a bit of ambiguity about how do we, if we talk about our colonial heritage, like the Central Vista, for instance, are we somehow celebrating it? But so those are definitely gray areas, but we should acknowledge them. Like, history is not straightforward. History is not straightforward. There is a lot of layering. Yes, for instance, Parliament House was built by the British, but it is Indian legislators who have sat there right from its very beginning. That was where our constitution was debated and passed. So this is of prime importance as a building to our history as such. So there should be no ambiguity about it. But I think, again, what Live History does is it clarifies some of these issues in the minds of people. We need to talk about these things because they're not self-evident. That's how we need to go ahead with this. Awareness is very important. Heritage walks, other kinds of media, very important.
Right. That brings us to the other issue of why be selective about the way we look at heritage. See, our heritage is our heritage. It's our history, and it is a chronicle of our history. We can't pick and choose. But I must say, for all the talk and all the chest thumping, there is one thing which is universal: apathy. Because it knows no color, no creed. It could be a temple, it could be a mosque, it could be a church. I mean, it's the same across the country. So I don't think, we actually walk the talk on anything. It's really just talk. And, most of our monuments are going to dust. And, it's universal. I'm going to take a couple of other questions. So I keep peeping into my screen over here for them. Okay, so one question which I really like, which I must take up is how do we get students to participate in something like this? Every city has a university, has history departments, and I think it would be such a fabulous tool if we can get the students of a city, of a town, involved in their local heritage. I mean, they could be great foot soldiers, and what an experience it is to really go and map our history. We have a series called Backpacking Through History for Students, but listen, how can we institutionalize something like this? How can we get history departments? And that's a question that a student, I think, has asked Nilay, saying, how can we as students help contribute in this heritage conversation? Because at the end of the day, that's the future of India. And that's the legacy that we are saving for them.
See, you become very creative when you have no money. And in Ahmedabad, exactly the same thing happened. I was sitting in the municipality with absolutely no money. But I felt that everybody was supporting because the citizen. And one of the biggest thing in Ahmedabad, you go today, we have got fabulous institution, a National Institute of Design, we have Indian Institute of Ahmedabad Management, School of Architecture, hundreds of wonderful schools today and since last 20 years. Every college, schools, and institutions of Ahmedabad taken up Ahmedabad's heritage as their research. So so old city has been used as a knowledge center, the knowledge resource. Like one day we declared to make it competition, open competition for the filmmaker, amateur filmmaker, to make a 3 minutes film on the old city of Ahmedabad. You know how many participants came? 600 participants landed from all over India, and they made 85 films on the history, on the 3 minutes films on the heritage of Ahmedabad. So in Ahmedabad, we are very successful to have like many schools taking heritage as their annual festival, where the kids walk. And the in Ahmedabad, when you had nobody around you, you see that everybody is with you. So the student, in fact, we are now almost thinking of making a book where all these exercise done by the students, like the kindergarten schools, normal schools, institutions, how they have before no one looked at the old city. So one day I took 40 artists for the heritage walk, and they came and painted the old city. And today hundreds of our new artists are students are painting the old city. There are retired art school teacher association. They are now taking classes in the poles old city with the local community students to paint their own neighborhood, in the sense making paintings. So in Ahmedabad, the whole community resource and the institutional sources have been explored, and I think it has been really, really successful. I mean, that makes us very happy that they have owned the city and taken it over.
Dipanjan, few people, I don't know how many people on this show know that Dipanjan is one of the most popular RJs in Kolkata, sorry. And he's got a huge fan following. So Dipanjan, are you going to hold up the flag of heritage and get kids excited about heritage? I mean, is that something that is worth giving a shot?
Well, for on radio for about I think about a year, I had done this kind of short 3.5 minute little pieces which would play out on Sundays, where I'd mostly concentrate on stories about Calcutta and the history of the city and things like that. And I was unable to continue because well, I had problems of my own, but it did get a very good response, which leads me to believe that if you can tell a story well, there are people who are willing to listen. And I mean, I did obscure things on that. I once said, okay, there are only three places in Calcutta where you can still see the British coat of arms. One of them is the Victoria Memorial, one is the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. I want you to find the third one. And if you find it, send a photograph, take a photograph and send it to me. And there were actually people who went and found it. And it's a very obscure little building. And I was very surprised. But that's been my sort of experience, that if you can tell a story well, there will be people who will be listening. You will generate interest, particularly in Calcutta. I think it works quite well. But unfortunately, like you've been saying, that history, the way we perceive it is that it's something very boring. It's probably because of the way we've been taught history in school.
Mm.
if you're taught about a site, if you're probably taught about something that is in the city or within a few hours drive, think about taking a bunch of school students there and saying, chapter 3, page 12, that thing you read, this is what it actually is. You can touch it.
Yeah.
If we could do something like that, it would be fabulous. I mean, for the longest time, I haven't managed to make a trip to Delhi yet, but I've been talking to friends, and my interest in Delhi really began after I read The Last Mughal. And I've been asking friends that, I read this in Last Mughal, is that still there? And I read about this armory being blown up, is that gate still there? And people have been telling me, yeah, so the gate is in the middle of a road, you can go and take a photograph of it if you want, it's got a nice plaque up there. So that's the level of interest you manage to generate if you present a story well. If you start with in the year 1762, when the great it's just going to put everybody
And
to.
by the way, we don't even have one story that starts like that. So our criteria of a story, it has to be a very good story. So we are very agnostic from which era it comes, etc., etc. But it has to be a very, very good story. And that's why, by the way, I must plug this in. We touch about 1.5 million people every month. So, and it's a very diverse set of people. Most of them have not studied history, so it's really fabulous. And we've got also, of course, the Dons from Oxford watching us and reading our stories. But let me take this question now. Swapna, it boils down to the fact that we are terrible at telling stories, okay? We've not done a good job. So Devashish Mazumdar asked, why don't we market our historical sites like any other European country? I mean, over there, the entire economy is based on tourism. Look at the potential we have on creating local jobs, on creating an exciting ecosystem where it can be self-sustaining. I think our monuments tell so many stories, and anybody visiting India is visiting it for its history and culture. And yet we've done such a shoddy job of telling our own story.
I would like to, just take off from where Dipanjan was talking about and what Debashish was also talking about, uh, popularizing history through walks, through talks, those kind of things. So yes, this is something that Delhi is very hot on. There are lots of walks. In fact, so many organizations doing walks, many of them are making a commercial success of it. And that's very important. You have to be able to make a commercial success for it. It cannot be just enthusiasts. You have to tell people that this is something that is a viable livelihood. That's, I think, very important. So it's good that people are managing to do that. There are heritage clubs in schools and all that sort of thing, of course, is happening. There are people who are doing creative things like food experiences, monument experiences. I think where the lack happens is that there is the enabling sort of the infrastructure, the state support to pull all these things together, to package, at some level, the packaging of all these things, maybe it's a tourist department that needs to do it. The problem is that many of our government departments and agencies think that anything that they don't produce, they cannot market. If you see the difference there. When you go visit an ASI site, it should have a bookshop which will have every kind of product.
Yeah.
It should not restrict itself to ASI published material. It should have all sorts of
point here, Swapna. I've never been to a monument where I found a book on that monument over there. I've only found books of other monuments in far off areas. So I'm also very, curious to know who curates these books in these shops, but that's another matter. But Mr. Naik, we often blame the ASI for a lot of our problems, right? But I've interacted with so many fabulous ASI officials at the state level, at the center level. They also have their hands tied. I think the latest Niti Aayog, document says that India has about 400,000 monuments, out of which I think the protected monuments are less than 4,000 in this country. If you look at centrally protected monuments, yeah. We are cash strapped with arcade system. There are many problems. So we have one question which has come from Kripa Williams, who has an observation saying that preservation needs to be a community effort and not dependent on any one stakeholder. We need to drive pride in our heritage. And I think I agree with that point of view. because it is not anybody else's headache unless a local community is interested in its own heritage, protects it, and understands the value it creates. How are we going to save every one of our monuments in far off areas or many cities? So, you were telling us that you have been called in to set up these heritage councils within municipalities in different towns. Tell us about it. What is the progress? What is the mandate you have over there, and what is the actual change that you're seeing on the ground?
See, the whole secret of successful of the heritage cell or department is you have to create a leader within the local community or within the municipality, and you have to continuously follow. And one of the way I found that you initiate something very innocent called heritage walk and connected with some local groups or tourism department and happening. Like if you go to Lucknow today, there's a whole group of, if you go to the UP tourism website, you'll find a Lucknow walks. There are two walks, and it has been done regularly for last 10 years. And in the process, it has been touching so many old abandoned Havelis. And gradually, when the top officials who never walks, they always pass through their own vehicle, are busy. When they take a leisurely walk with this guide and suddenly look at this building, and it must be restored. Today in Lucknow, amazing number of building has been rediscovered, and because Lucknow was originally very well documented. Similarly, in Amritsar, we started this walk, and from this town hall, and it ended near the Golden Temple. And today, the last government has done a very huge 1 kilometer massive walk, which totally little bit reinterpreted, wrongly interpreted the idea of the walk, but that has become very popular. It has been taken up and upscaled it in a very massive way. So I feel that we have worked in small municipalities and talked to them, and they all like it. But there are a lot of attempts happen through Indian Heritage Cities Network and many other network to initiate that. But I feel the secret is that you have to work with the local community, identify a local leader, and quietly legislate the process and establish a heritage cell and also a community-based organization. That way, INTAC also played an important role for doing that. So I think it is a continuous process, and we have around 77,000 historic towns and cities in India. And I think it will. That's why I started the master's program in heritage management, where we can create this manager where the admission anybody can join in that course. There's no age limit. There is no particular subject expertise. Anybody can join if they fulfill the criteria. So we have to create a lot of these managers. And now with Gandhi Gujarat Vidyapeeth, we are working on something called rural heritage management, where the people from the villages also understand and recognize the value of heritage. So we have to literally work in mass scale. It's a continuous process. Only thing, many institutions should be your partner, where this training program can be multiplied.
Right. I'm going to ask you a very loaded question. It's come from one of our viewers. Ketan Bende asks, lack of finance has always been a problem, but does the ideology of a government also have its impact on preservation of monuments and heritage?
Deepak.
Yeah, only to be expected in times like this, but not I it keeps getting talked about, and there's a lot of controversy around it, but I haven't really seen the ideology of a government significantly impacting preservation of monuments.
Right.
What I have seen is maybe the ideology of a government affecting changes in the way cities are run. Certain areas receive maybe a little more importance than others, but that is, I think, par for the course. Uh, but I don't really think that because one government comes to power, a certain set of monuments get more attention, or if another government comes to power, another set of I've never really seen that happening in my experience.
Right. I would add to that. I would say that, the fact is that, as I was mentioning earlier, I think the only common factor is apathy, actually. And that's what we have to fight. Let me give you a statistic. very interestingly, you talk about Murshidabad, you talk about Shahjahanabad, you talk about Pune, the Peshwai Pune, and the damage, or even Lucknow, the damage done during the British era because of the fact that there was a concerted attempt to undermine these cities, which were
Yes.
seen as powerful regional centers. It was a political ploy to actually, turn a Red Fort into barracks, to have a lunatic asylum within Shaniwar Wada. Murshidabad was systematically brought down to its knees, so to say. And what is sad is that, even after independence, Swapna, I mean, we've just continued with that apathy. If that was a political ploy, we have turned that conscious neglect into apathy. And I think that is what is very frustrating for me. If you are passionate about it, please go ahead and save a monument. But don't be so completely, nonchalant about the problems that we are facing on the ground. And I think that's the larger issue, really, because I don't think that apathy has any kind of ideology. It is just apathy, So let's come back to the attempts that are being made right now, Swapna. You know, we talk about the central vista, and it's a controversial topic. Now, of course, it is already underway. They're waiting for environment clearances for a lot of these projects. What does it do to any kind of campaign on saving our cities, heritage management, when you have something like this, which is, against all wishes, or even without any kind of discussion happening?
I think there are a lot of misconceptions around this. And again, we have to come back to the idea that we have heritage is, of course, seen in a very negative way, because a lot of people feel that heritage is something that has to be monuments preserved in pristine condition. And without realizing, so there are many things lacking there, because you think of monument, but you don't think of the surroundings, the setting in which it is. Then you don't think that a living city, which may be a heritage city or a heritage precinct, it needs to grow and develop as well. It will change. It will change. And because your ideas of heritage become so very straitjacketed, you don't allow for discussion of how to bring about change, because you're so busy, because your whole idea is about preserving and freezing in time, that you do not give enough attention to what can be done. I think that is one thing that has been lacking in a lot of discussion about not only Central Vista, but our heritage in general. We have not laid down, when you have these blanket things like, no development within this radius or whatever, what we are not doing is giving attention to a particular site and saying, okay, for this site, this is what can be done, and this is what cannot be done. So then what happens is, then the kind of opposition is set up between heritage versus development, that debate that happens. Okay, you are conservationists, you don't want to change anything, and we are the development lobby, and we want to change things. So that opposition that is set up, that becomes problematic for heritage areas, because heritage precincts need development, but heritage-led development. That is, the idea that you have to develop, you have to change. And because you cannot have that dialogue, and the dialogue is not about one side not listening to the other, both are equally not listening to each other often.
Right. Mr. Naik, you worked with the government for many decades now. Tell me, is anything changing? Do you see? Because what also amazes me is that all the bureaucrats, they would have studied history, because history is such an important subject for the IAS, exams.
Yeah.
That is allowed. I mean, wouldn't they have all studied history? Wouldn't they be interested in it? Are you seeing change on the ground in the last 20 years, or is it going further back in people's minds?
See, I remember there is an institute in Ahmedabad to train the Gujarat administrative officers. And I had taken 2 classes before the earthquake happened. And after the earthquake, when I traveled around the towns and of Gujarat, I met many of these officers who said, "Sir, you told us that this is important, and I have barricaded the thing so that it could be restored. In a simple 2 classes, it can really change the attitude of a officers, because they have never learned in the schools, in the colleges, that this is important. So I feel that education have to play a major role, and I have seen many officers. They are so, once they are into the job, they are so bogged down with their daily affairs. Because I sat through offices of these municipal deputy commissioners and commissioners, and seen that they are so busy that they can't even put their head up. So many time I think that they are very willing and they are oriented. Unless they really have to resolve an issue, they never really look into it unless somebody is personally interested in it. Somehow, whoever the IS officers got in touch with me, like in Ahmedabad, one day the chief minister ordered 300 IS officers go for the heritage walk. And because of that, today we have in Ahmedabad the heritage regulation, because chief secretary and all the top IS officers are involved. So I think we have to involve the people who take decisions, but we have to have a very systematic approach to create this awareness and give them some incentive or tools to support that.
But Mr. Naik, I must say that we work very closely with the Gujarat Tourism Department, and it's fabulous to see how much initiative they take, to actually go out and do work around heritage, especially in crafts. And it's not just about monuments; it's about a holistic approach. And I think they also have a scheme which has been pointed out to me about adopting a heritage monument by private players, etc. Now that was tried at the national level also, and I think Gujarat it has been far more successful. Uh, Swapna, I have a question from Asad Lalji, who asks, is there a global benchmark? See, also what happens is very often when we are comparing heritage, we are looking towards the West, where there is a very mature model. They've been at it for a long time. They have lower they don't have the issues that we have of density of population, etc. They can manage their heritage better. Are there lessons to be learned from the East? I mean, look at Cambodia or Vietnam. And by the way, let me also share a very appalling statistic for you. Do you know that Vietnam gets more foreign tourists than India does as a country? And this is the statistics from 2019, which really was jaw-dropping from my perspective, because look at the size of Vietnam and look at the size of India. And that is the truth. The fact is that India is falling off the tourism map globally. And of course, forget the COVID year, but that's the fact. So, Swapna, should we look east? What are the examples that we should be looking at where communities have been brought in, where there has been a kind of a holistic approach? Are we looking at very archaic laws, archaic formats? Are we very rigid? And that's one thing that comes through this discussion, that we are being very rigid about the way we see our heritage.
I think it's not so much, I think, a difference between East and West, but the problem is that we have got stuck on an old on a system which is even outdated in the West, which was our colonial heritage, the old ASI heritage of looking at monuments as either ruins. That is something that has been problematic, where every restoration or has been looked at as with suspicion. You have to maintain ruins. You cannot rebuild a building. Whereas in Europe they've moved ahead on this. To a lot has happened there. So I think it is not so much there. But one of the things, I mean, I'm sorry to go off on a tangent here, but one of the things that really we need to see is that one of the reasons why Agra, for instance, tourists would like to spend just one day, quickly touch the fort, the Itmad-ud-Daula at most, or the Taj Mahal, and just run away. Why should they not want to spend time in the city? We have to look at what we are doing to our old cities, which do not, and this is something which would improve the lives of the people as well. If you improve the quality of life of people in a historic town like Shahjahanabad, like old Agra, you will make people's lives better, but also turn them into places where people would like to come and spend time. So what becomes a day trip in Agra will become a 3-4 day stay and exploration, because after a day's sightseeing, people want something to do in the evening as well.
Right. You
I'd
know, the,
just like to
yeah,
weigh in on the Agra thing with my personal experience. When I was planning for my trip, I was discussing with friends who had been there, and I told them that I plan to stay in Agra for 7 days. The universal reaction was, "You'll get bored. What will you do?" But I just had this nice little rolly guide to Agra, and I just went off picking one obscure monument after another. And I had the advantage of having a driver who literally knew the entire town like the back of his hand. So I just tell him so and so's tomb. He said, "Yeah, so about 12 kilometers from here, I can take you there in so much time." So that I think is also a very important part for a visitor or a tourist to have access to a person like this who can show you around the town. Otherwise, it can get very difficult. I mean, in Calcutta, for example, we have a lot of books published which are called walking guides. I mean, they have completely planned routes and walks, which you can just pick up one of these books and you can do it on your own. There aren't too many of these books for other cities. That's one thing which is needed. And to give credit where credit is due, ASI does a good job with Ajanta and Ellora with their books. If you don't have a guide with you and you just have those books, they're actually pretty fabulous because they'll tell you cave number so and so, enter, and on your right, you'll see this. So that kind of information and access is actually essential.
let's also look at heritage beyond monuments, Mr. Naik, because as Dipanjan said, there are many other intangible heritage areas that we should be looking at. I mean, we are working, for instance, with the marble inlay workers of Agra, and it's fascinating the kind of the motifs and the iconography that they are using, and the old formats that they're using. This is true to Patan also, for example, where the monuments are not there, but the Patan Patola is there, which is again there's a lovely museum over there on the side, and of course you have great monuments there outside the city of Patan. But how do we create a holistic approach where when we tell a story of not just the monument, but the community, the ancient city? Because I think Patan is also a great example. You have the Ran Ki Vav, you have the Modhera temple, but within Patan, what it lacks is a city museum which actually tells the story of Patan. Now, what can we do to address these things?
See, if you go across India, there is very few city has a city museum. Calcutta has a Calcutta Gallery in the Victoria Memorial, and in Ahmedabad we have a city museum. But otherwise, if you look at the whole India, there is no city museum. So I think the one of the major thing government can do it as a policy that every city should have a city museum, because Patan definitely need a city museum, because the plan of the city is not available. And people have, like, if you go to Hampi, there is a whole model of Hampi in the archaeology museum which was made long back, but that gives you a kind of a overall idea of the city. So the need of a city museums across the country, I think, is a very, very important.
We've got other questions coming in. There's a question on Ahmedabad, but I'll let you take a breath over there. Swapna, do public-private, this is a question from Vivek Sibbal, who asks, do public-private partnerships work better for preserving, promoting heritage than purely government initiatives? For example, Sundar Nursery in Delhi, which is in a collaboration between the Aga Khan Trust. See, the Aga Khan Trust has done some fabulous work in Delhi. Humayun's tomb is one of them. So that has set a benchmark for what a private-public partnership can be. But, there was such a lot of controversy when the government came out with a plan to let, private enterprise come and adopt monuments, for instance. But I know a lot of heritage enthusiasts who said that, listen, it's required, let's get it done. So is there a lot of also, where people don't want to change, they don't want to try out new things? Is that a big problem? And should we be looking more actively at this private-public partnership?
Of course we should, definitely. I mean, the Monument Mitra, the idea of bringing private enterprise in to provide infrastructure at monuments was a great idea. The only problem was that there was very little idea of how this would be implemented. And of course, there was a lot of misinformation also. People mistakenly thought that a lot of conservation work would be done by people who were not involved, who had no expertise in conservation. So that was a bit of misinformation, but also there was a lack of clarity on how this would work. For instance, the whole idea that you would be making toilets or cafeterias in sites where there might be a lot of underground archaeology. How will you manage that? I think what has happened with Aga Khan Trust, it is a professional body which has a long track record of conservation in sites. So that kind of model really succeeds, and they have been very intensive in their work. They've taken up this site, and they take up sites and they invest a lot of time and energy in that particular site. And I think what really needs to work is a body which takes up a particular site, works on it, and brings all, it's not as if AKTC or Aga Khan Trust is doing everything there. They are bringing in the municipal corporation, they're bringing in the ASI, and working with them in not only a monument, but in the surrounding area, like the Nizamuddin Basti. So all those kind of things have to work together. But these are things that cannot be, they cannot be implemented overnight. It takes time, and site specific. It has to be site specific. You cannot have one size fits all. It has to be worked out how this has to work, who monitors it, what is their credibility. All these things matter.
Right. In Ahmedabad, there's a question from Devashri Rabde, who asked, has Ahmedabad now integrated their town planning with heritage conservation after becoming a World Heritage City? The tag is one thing, Mr. Nayak. What is the continuation of this engagement to ensure that a heritage city is well maintained? Because it's a work in progress at any given day. It's not about the tag, it's really about how the journey is.
The benefit of Ahmedabad was that it was the whole the system, the management plan was already in place before it was declared as a World Heritage Place. Mm-hmm. And the only thing is that before it has 12,000 listed buildings, and after the declaration we had an opportunity to really survey. Now we have around 3,000 buildings which is officially declared as heritage. We have the financial system in place. And now we have because it was within the municipal system, so that we have a building inspector, engineers, retired officers from ASI, and we have a good service system. We have to manage the finance, we have a World Heritage Trust built within the municipal corporation, which works with the heritage department hands in hand and resolve a lot of issues on daily basis. So the including the community participation, celebration. So because the whole system was in place and media was trained to cover these stories, whatever the success stories or maybe negatively happening. So I think that Ahmedabad case system was in place, and definitely the World Heritage status strengthened that process actually.
Right.
So it was already there.
Right. We have a question which has come, which I want to take really. It's from Sanjay Ghosh, who asks about Shishupalgarh in Odisha. What is the state of the excavated site? And I must tell you that I went in short over there. It was one of the places that I was dying to go to because it's such a fabulous story, Shishupalgarh, which was perhaps the capital of Kalinga. And I must tell you, the day before I actually visited the site, I spoke to the archaeologist who sounded completely depressed. And I wasn't surprised because when I went and saw the site, it was in the most dismal condition that you can think of, because there was encroachment all over. And even the photographs that we had of what the excavation site had unearthed, there was nothing visible out there. And I remember the site of these pillars that you see on the street. It's supposed to have been the pillars of a great palace or a hall. And the archaeologists who excavated there told me that they had actually found 25 odd more. They kept it buried under the ground because they felt it was safer over there. So this is the state of what our great cities are. And of course, Shishupalgarh is also just outside Bhubaneswar. So it has all the problems of a big city spilling over. And I've been told that there have been many cases of residents over there finding old, archaeological pieces or of sculptures, etc. And they're not even reporting it because they don't want to talk about it and they don't want attention to come there. So it's a really sad situation. Dipanjan, I'm going to ask you this question because you did refer to how history is being taught in schools. So I'm going to ask you this question that has come from Karthik, saying, do history teachers need to be trained? Do they need to be reoriented? Really? Uh,
Yeah, probably a little bit, most certainly. I mean, the entire education system needs to be reoriented, I would guess, because it cannot just be about scoring marks. If you're not learning something and if you're not having fun, it's really not worth it. I mean, I write about history and heritage now. When I was in school, up until I think class 11, history was something very boring because the books were terribly written, and we had to do these pointless things like you had dates on one column and events on another, and you draw arrows and match them, and that's one of the most rubbish things I've ever done. I mean, all it encourages is for you to memorize things. That does not help. The first time I remember actually developing interest in history was when I got up to class 11, and we had something called world history. And there was this book which I think was done by a major historian, but for young children. And it had the story of the First World War and the Second World War, and there were maps and there were photographs, and it kind of put everything in a context for me. And that was great. I went through that entire book in like a week, and I was like, this is great. Why? What have I been doing all my life? You know. So that is definitely there. Again, my interest also grew out of heritage walks, which in Calcutta was started by my classmate Iftikhar Ehsan, who actually one evening said, "Come, I'll show you what I show the tourists." And he took me around Calcutta, and it was a completely different experience for me. And I was like, "This is the city I live in. Wow!" There's a whole bunch of things I didn't know. There's a major reorientation. I think that's needed. But I've seen some city schools actually doing it. There are heritage clubs and things of that nature, and
Absolutely. And we plan to do a lot of work with students. But there is we have to wind down this because I can go on having this discussion through the evening, but we must wind down and also tell our viewers of what we're going to have next week. But Swapna, I must get you in here. One of the things that I feel very sad about because I wanted to be an archaeologist at one point and I never got down to doing it. But now I, have a special place in my heart for archaeology. But the fact is that excavations, 2013, there was this terrible CAG report, which actually, not terrible report, but a report which underlined the terrible state of affairs as far as Indian heritage is concerned and pointed out that just less than 1% of ASI's budget is going for archaeological excavations. Okay? So I'm going to ask you about this particular thing. Why aren't we doing follow-on archaeological excavations in many sites? For example, if you look at Lalkot, which is one of the oldest cities, oldest parts of Delhi. It's the pre-Sultanate era capital. There haven't been excavations done after the first tranche. In Patna, we've done a little bit of mapping. Most excavations were done in the 50s and 60s, and then it was dropped like a hot potato, and I don't know what happened to excavations. In many cases, of course, that's a special show I'm going to do one day on how late many of the reports, archaeological excavation reports are, because they haven't actually been reported. So nobody knows what has happened in those excavations. But what is the delay? Why aren't more excavations being done? Even in a city like Delhi, which needs to be excavated, there's very little news around that.
I think what the bit that you said at the end, that is very relevant. Reports where excavations have been done, reports have not been published. Archaeology, like any other area of history, it thrives on debate. You have to have, until the reports are published, what is the idea of excavation? Idea of excavation is to increase our knowledge about a particular site, about a period of history, whatever. And it has become a headline grabbing thing. We've done this excavation in Purana Kila. Have we found evidence of the Mahabharata or not? That's not the point. When you have done, where are the published reports of Lalkot? Forget that follow-up excavation has not been done. Even the original excavation, where do we have the detailed reports published that we can debate it, we can discuss it? And until no discipline thrives without that kind of academic discussion, and that academic discussion is not possible without the publication. So I think that is where, we have to start at that, to say, and when you publish, when you discuss, then that will lead on to further excavations. And that's one problem that is probably, it's the ASI that which takes the lead in excavation, and at least leads excavation. These are things that they have to introspect on, I think, to talk about how this will go forward from here.
So let's get concluding remarks. I don't know, we've got a lot of interesting insights over here. I think the one thing that I have taken away is that, hey, it's not somebody else's problem, it's our problem, the way we treat our heritage. And I think each one of us is responsible, has to be responsible, has to be active, has to have an interest in giving back. You can't just have one stakeholder who's in charge of the whole thing. The second is our entire definition of heritage has to change with the changing times. Also, it has to be far more inclusive. We need to get communities, local communities involved. And the third is really every stakeholder should be part of this conversation, and that's the only way to do it. But I'm going to get concluding remarks for you. What is the one thing that you would like to see happen if we were to save our cities? What is the one big idea that you think should be implemented to make change happen? Let's start off with Mr. Naik.
Well, I feel that there should be more and more heritage walks, and all the young kids and the energetic elderly people, students, everybody create their own path, and they celebrate the city. That is very, very crucial, and appreciate, and they become a force, so that administration, politician, everybody have to support that, and that is the way to go. Yeah.
Right. Dipanjan?
This, of course, is from my personal experiences. This is something LHI has been doing very well, which is there are a lot of academics out there who are working on sites, who are working on history, who are working on heritage. However, all the research material, or at least the vast majority of it that is generated, seems to remain within that very restricted academic circle. Apart from me and a few people who are like me, I don't think too many people take the pains of reading, PhD theses or things like that if they're on an interesting topic. So number one, the information that is there, the research that is happening, that needs to come out of the libraries, and it needs to reach the common people, and it needs to reach them in a form that is understandable, in a form that is engaging. I mean, I can give you the last 20 years of ASI reports, and I can guarantee nobody other than a few archaeologists are actually going to read it, because they're not terribly interesting to read unless you've got that kind of thing. So, yeah, so there's a lot of academic work happening. Unless that translates into stories which ordinary people can understand, we're not going to make a lot of headway. And heritage walks, I think, in this way is very crucial, because a lot of them are led by academics who actually make the information more accessible. So that's a great step.
Right. Swapna?
Well, I would quickly say, of course, I agree with a lot of what has been said already. So let me talk about something totally different, which is to say that the day that every government department, whether it is the Bijli or Pani or municipal, all sorts of functions, whether it's the land development agency, begins to see heritage, because heritage is invisible, when we make our plans, whatever we do. If they just start looking at heritage, every time you dig up a road, do think of the heritage that is there also. So we should start looking at heritage everywhere. Heritage is not a separate thing from everything else. And once we start looking at heritage as an everyday thing, which is a layer which runs through a city, which has to be considered at every step, whatever we do, I think that's what I would really love to see.
Right. And that's why that's the whole idea of Live History India and the show, Swapna, mainstreaming history. I think for me, the one thing that stands out when if I'm to look at a problem like this, is that history has to be made engaging for every person. It's not something that only history buffs should be talking about.
Right.
And that's the one thing that I'm very proud of as far as Live History India is concerned, because we've opened up history to a whole world of people who never actually studied history or engaged with history, because it is our history. And every person engages or connects with history in their own way. And the fact is that our entire system has made us think in silos. You know, if you are left brain or right brain, or if you're science or history or arts, I mean, we've all been conditioned to think that. And that's complete anomaly, because I think the best work is being done by people who are not necessarily people who studied history, but who have come back to history. And that love for history has to be, actually encouraged in every community, at the local level, at the municipal school level, at the at the digital level, at every level. And I think unless that happens, unless you realize how important it is to save our past for our future, unless that happens, I don't think we would have done justice to the kind of history we have. And we've got a fantastic legacy which we all need to nurture. Thank you, Swapna, Dipanjan, and Mr. Nayak for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you. And we've got a very exciting lineup of conversations like this for you every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Do tune in. I'm not going to reveal what we are going to be doing next Wednesday, but it's super exciting. So do watch out for our alerts. And thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.